Welcome to Gojo Secure. Expand your mind.
This training video will elevate your awareness of one of the central principles that guides how we operate in this law firm: understanding the value of attention to detail. Attention to detail is a phrase that is commonly used by the U.S. military, by corporations, and other high-performance organizations. The phrase encompasses the notion that in order to perform in a demanding, highly competitive, or adversarial environment, such as a high-level litigation firm, an individual's awareness to the importance of detail is one of the key qualities that will propel that person and the rest of his or her team to success. In this short presentation, we will discuss two fascinating and highly educational examples of how a lack of attention to detail cost Napoleon the Battle of Waterloo and cost the lives of many people in a crash during an attempted takeoff at Denver International Airport. The mythical saying goes, "For the want of a nail, the shoe was lost. For the want of a shoe, the horse was lost. And for want of a horse, the rider was lost, being overtaken and slain by the enemy. All for the lack of care about a horseshoe nail." The devil is in the details. Either way, the point is that the details of a situation can affect the outcome. Those who only consider the big picture tend to succeed where they are supported by or accompanied by others who fret over the minor things, the details, the little things that can cost you victory or even your life. But without that level of attention, disaster can surely follow. We've all heard of the book, "Don't Sweat the Petty Stuff," and we like to think that we can reduce stress in our lives by focusing exclusively on the big ticket items that really matter. But in that way, we are often just kidding ourselves, whistling past the graveyard, as the saying goes. But the truth is that if you ignore the details, it won't be for long, for they will come at you with a vengeance when it's too late. And here's the proof. We begin our story in 1813 with Napoleon's attempt to invade Russia. Napoleon was an ambitious commander with a formidable army. His conquest for empire and his thirst for military victory outweighed his own common sense and that of his commanding generals. He is famous for saying that he was successful because he surrounded himself with people who were smarter than himself, but in fact his greatest follies flowed from his cavalier disregard for the wisdom afforded to him by those brilliant advisors. But his ego was not his downfall. His failure to attend to detail was the cause of his infamous military defeats. We begin our study of his errors with the attempt he made in 1813 to invade Russia just a little over 100 years ago. The map you see here was drawn by Robert Menard and is one of the finest examples of early graphical information visualization ever created. The strength of Napoleon's troops is plotted against its geographical distance from home and the prevailing temperatures. Napoleon set out with his army to conquer vast territories without considering the logistics of supply, the likelihood of unplanned retreat, and the attrition of his forces that would be caused by freezing temperatures, exhaustion, starvation. As his infantry moved further and further from its supply sources, nature, cold, and enemy forces who were closer to their own supply lines as he advanced took their toll. Eventually, Napoleon's forces were thinned to the point of decimation. The cold, the loss of morale, the ever stronger enemies confronted as Napoleon's army moved further and further into enemy territory, all took a toll. Massive casualties mounted day after day, week after week, month after month. Napoleon lost almost all of his men. His ambitions, as powerful as they were defeated by the realities of battle. The cause? His failure to consider the realities of the battlefield in advance, and his failure to plan meticulously for those realities. Tens of thousands died because of a lack of planning. But Napoleon was anything but a quitter. His ego and his thirst for global domination were unrelenting, and he eventually rebuilt his army. Then he made a new stab, this time to the north, into what is now known as Germany, Prussia at the time, and England, where coalition forces of the combined armies of several smaller nation-states joined together to fight off Napoleon. The decisive battle of this campaign is known as the Battle of Waterloo, which was fought in a single day and which claimed the lives of over 55,000 soldiers. Napoleon lost this war, and history traces this lost war to a lost battle. Worse, history traces that lost battle to a single logistical failure. The failure to ensure that supplies needed for battle would be present when they were needed, where they were needed, in adequate supply and easily at hand to accomplish a key task, which, when it was needed, meant the difference between life and death. In those days, wars were fought with defined battle lines. There were long lines of opposing soldiers that would engage one another in disciplined filings, rows of men and artillery that would join in battle in what at first was a highly regimented formation and which eventually turned into a massive cloud of chaotic butchery. The battle line would shift and flow back and forth, waxing and waning like a water line with the rise and fall of the tide, while men died on both sides, with slower dying forces moving forward and the faster dying forces falling back. As one force moved forward, it had to overcome the soldiers on the other side and eventually move through a zone of death that was the artillery fire zone, in which everything that moved could be cut down by raining cannonballs that would explode with shrapnel or blast through rows and rows of fighting men. To move forward in an infantry unit of this kind meant surviving sharpshooters, close quarter battle with sabers and daggers and muskets, and eventually moving through the artillery fire zone. Napoleon's men made it through, and they breached the artillery lines of the Prussian army. They eventually made it to the inner lines of the enemy artillery, and when they did this, they were further from their own supply lines than they had ever been. The further a fighting force gets from its own supply sources, the more foreseeable it is that that force will be overcome by the enemy, who is closer and closer to his own base. So retreat becomes a more and more foreseeable eventuality. Some retreats are strategic, meaning that they're temporary and only intended to facilitate reinforcement and resupply. Medicines, food, fresh soldiers, and a new thrust follow a strategic retreat, but the simple geometry of the situation requires that the advancing, then retreating, then advancing army move back and forth through fire zones of enemy artillery. Finally, if it survives, it reaches the enemy artillery lines, killing the soldiers who man the cannons. But now, farther than ever from home, and thus in ever greater danger of a forced strategic retreat, the army knows that it must destroy that artillery line, because it may have to move back through that death zone. Cannon in those days were set at a fixed pitch for maximum distance. They were extremely heavy, they were difficult to move, and very difficult to upend if they became fouled or had to be cleaned of debris. They were not easily maintained if the finely calibrated barrels were clogged with something that would prevent the smooth passage of cannonballs that were just ever so slightly smaller than the diameter of the cannon barrel. This was the Achilles heel of the cannon of that era. And when a cannon was disabled by such debris, it had to be completely upended to pour out all that was in the breech of the cannon, to recharge the cannon with powder, fodder, and balls so that it could fire correctly once again without exploding in the face of the artillerymen who operated the cannon. That process could take hours for a group of men to complete, so fouling the cannon was easy, but only if the advancing army had the right materials with which to do that. For this reason, barrels of nails were part of the staple supply lists that every army carried with it. Just as important as food, just as important as water, just as important as ammunition, nails to foul the artillery of an enemy meant the difference between breaching the line of death just once or having to move back and forth through it several times in a row, with each successive encounter killing off more and more of one's own army. Thus, when Napoleon's forces breached the Prussian artillery lines at great cost to Napoleon's army, which lost 20,000 men in the effort, Napoleon was exultant. He knew that a strategic retreat was more than a possibility, however, because by that time his army was overextended. Yet now he could foul the enemy artillery and await further resupply so long as enemy reinforcements were themselves delayed in reaching the supporting artillery line that he had just taken. So Napoleon gave the command, "Strike the artillery, foul the cannons," and his men relayed the command, "Strike the artillery, bring the nails." These cannon will kill no more of our precious men. But there were no nails. The supply sergeant, who was charged with the obligation to bring the nails to the opposing artillery line, had been neglectful in his planning. Napoleon summoned him, and when the man, trembling, appeared before Napoleon, Napoleon ran him through on the spot with a saber, and the man was dead before he hit the ground. But that was little comfort, because, as was to be expected, the coalition forces reached their own artillery lines with fresh reinforcements, fresh supplies, and ammunition. As Napoleon's men retreated, the coalition forces recharged their still functioning artillery and prepared to fire. Then they waited for Napoleon's army to retreat back through the death line a mile away, and the coalition forces opened fire. It should not have been possible. Those cannon should not have been capable of firing. Because of that simple lack of attention to detail, the cannon were ready to fire, and fire they did, and Napoleon's men dropped and were decimated. Was the supply sergeant an idiot? Was he overconfident? Was he drunk on the night that supplies were being inventoried and staged for transport to the forward battle line? Was he so filled with fear and dread of his own mortality that he could not focus on his job? We'll never know. It really doesn't matter. All that matters is that he did not know the lesson you are learning right now. Attention to detail can control the outcome of a battle or of a lawsuit. So for the want of a nail, the saying goes, a war was lost. Is that story limited in its usefulness to the primitive days of battle with muskets, swords, and fixed cannon? Not at all. We now look to the tragedy of Continental Flight 1713, which was planning a routine takeoff at Stapleton Airport in Denver several years ago. It was a cold winter day, but the weather was clearing. The pilots were eager to get into the sky, to get going again after a long period of waiting, of being grounded, impatient. But now with the weather improving, these pilots were complacent. They were overconfident, and they did not realize that every time a professional engages in a demanding task, his mood and his level of optimism must take a back seat to the realities of what he is undertaking to do. In this case, to overcome the laws of gravity and air pressure with the lives of countless passengers at stake. So the pilots were glib, careless, and in a hurry to make up time. And, like Napoleon's supply sergeant, they skipped an important step. They neglected to extend the flaps of their jet to the mandatory 10-degree takeoff position. They didn't even look at their checklist. Fathers, wives, mothers, and children died that day because the pilots were in too much of a hurry, too much overconfidence, and a lack of focus. So those people died, just as Napoleon's troops had done, all due to one thing: a failure to pay attention to detail. The reason is irrelevant. Whether they had a good excuse is irrelevant. Excuses do not undo the consequences of a failure to pay attention to detail. There is a higher, brighter, and more satisfying side to this message. You are at a point in your career where you are free of the sins of the Continental Flight 1713 pilots or of Napoleon's supply sergeant. You are yet to commit those errors, and you have the benefit of learning from their mistakes. You can rewrite your history before it even occurs by being mindful of this ever so vital, simple principle: that you can protect your clients from these kinds of mistakes only if you learn this one lesson. Attention to detail is essential. It's essential for a military general, for a pilot, for a doctor, for a mechanic working on a Formula One race car, for an astronaut, and for you, for an American trial lawyer. Your battles are no more forgiving than the laws of gravity or the ruthless coalition forces that slaughtered Napoleon's army. They are no more forgiving than Russian winters or any enemy who ever opposed one of us in court. None give us quarter, and all will capitalize on our failures to prepare with attention on the details that must be mustered and mastered before you set foot in court or in any corridor of legal battle. If you neglect to account for the rules of evidentiary foundation, for the importance of advanced scheduling, for the need to have valuable case law at ready reference in connection with all foreseeable legal issues, if you fail to plan, you are planning to fail. You must plan for potential breakdowns in your presentation, for the uncertain, for the random, for Murphy's Law, which says that anything that can go wrong will go wrong. Do not let this happen to you, or to your clients, or to your firm. As we move forward into a more and more technologically empowered future, the danger of complacency grows daily. Complacency means overconfidence and comfort when these things are not warranted by the true dangers lurking in the environment that may not be seen or perceived. We think the computer will do it for us, the secretary will do it for me, or the lawyer on the other side will do it for me, or the client will do it, or the judge will do it, or it won't be needed. What insanity. You will do it. You will do it all. We have given you the tools, the checklists, the task tracking software, and the substantive training aids to make the right decisions. But you will live or die on your own level of discipline and your own degree of attention to detail, and so will your client. Take this message to heart. Punish your opponent for failing to live by it, and keep yourself and your clients safe from harm, and distinguish yourself and your firm in the process. Thank you for watching.
Thank you for expanding your mind.